Week, we took a journey through American history to discover how faith and politics have frequently been intertwined. We saw how Christians have been for and against so many different political issues, almost for and against every war the United States has been involved in. We asserted that religious issues have been inserted in political campaigns from the beginning. People have always connected faith and politics, and the issues of faith influenced how people voted. We acknowledge that many of the important movements in American history were initiated and energized by people of faith. The abolitionist movement, the labor movement, prohibition, civil rights. But in this lesson, we want to look directly and particularly at our own religious tradition in Churches of Christ. What was the level of political involvement for the early leaders of the Stone Campbell movement? For those of you who may not know, the Stone Campbell movement is that's the terminology we use for our own beginning. There were two men that kind of started what they called the Reformation. We call it the Restoration, Barton Stone and Alexander Campbell. And what was the level of political involvement of them? What was the political viewpoint of these early leaders in the movement? To what extent have Church of Christ congregations become involved in political campaigns? What particular messages in our own history have been offered on faith and politics? Well, we're going to see that some of the early leaders of the Stone Campbell movement did actively participate in political issues. This is a picture of a young Alexander Campbell. Alexander Campbell served as a delegate to the 1829-1830 Constitutional Convention for the state of Virginia. And there he met and fraternized with several prominent political figures, including former Presidents James Madison, James Monroe, and Chief Justices of the Supreme Court, John Marshall. Here's a drawing of that convention. It's a picture of that convention. Campbell is seated on the very back row, the seventh person from the right. Campbell represented what some call the Western progressives, those who advocated for public education and the gradual end of slavery. According to one report, James Madison, who often disagreed with Campbell, said that he was one of the most impressive and skillful debaters at the convention. You may be aware that from our own history, a president has arisen, the 20th president of the United States. Future president, that president, James Garfield, attended Western Reserve Eclectic Institute, which today is Hiram College, an academic institution founded in 1850 by the disciples of Christ, which arose like we did from the Stone Campbell movement. Garfield himself later taught at Hiram College and preached at Disciples of Christ churches before entering the Union Army and serving in Congress. Before entering politics, Garfield, for a brief time, was the personal lawyer of Alexander Campbell's widow, Selina Campbell. Alexander Campbell himself, this is a picture of him 20 years later. You can tell he's older. He obviously still has that good hair. He founded Bethany College in 1840, the first institution of higher learning associated with Churches of Christ, and served as its president for 26 years, from 1840 to 1866. Why are we talking about Bethany College? Because in 1855, Bethany College was embroiled in a political controversy over slavery. In November of 1855, one of the Bethany students, Philip Burns, preached a sermon at the Bethany Church of Christ, indirectly condemning slavery and the morality of a church that would support it. Now remember, this is Virginia, the western part of Virginia, and a slave state. So when that young man preached that sermon, 20 or 30 members of the congregation got up and walked out. They just exited the church. And some of those who walked out began beating on the outside walls and windows of the church, trying to disrupt the preaching. The next day, a large group of Bethany students passed the following resolution. This is what this is the college students at Bethany College. We most heartily condemn all discussions of said question, slavery, either for or against, believing that the agitation of said question will prove disadvantageous to the vital interests of Bethany College. Well, in response to that, a group of Northern students drew up their own resolution, which included a demand for the right to discuss in public debate or in the pulpit the merits of American slavery. And 20 or more of those students refused to attend class until the administration allowed for a discussion of the subject. We're not going to class. We're not going to class unless you start talking about it. And by the way, this is not the 1960s. This is the 1850s. Well, Alexander Campbell, who was president at that time, obviously, announced that if the students would just return to class, there would be no penalty, no punishment. But 5 refused to return to class. And so Campbell expelled them. And when that happened, 5 other students left voluntarily. What happened at Bethany College was simply a prelude to the intense partisan divisions that occurred in churches of Christ during and immediately before the Civil War. Churches in the North refused to accept into fellowship churches of the South, and vice versa. And that division between the churches would continue for decades after the war was over, unfortunately. Alexander Campbell's own extended family was profoundly divided over the issue of the war and slavery. Campbell had a nephew named Archibald Campbell. He was a newspaper editor in Wheeling, Virginia, and he wrote an editorial opposing secession. He also became a major leader in the movement to create West Virginia in opposition to the Confederate state of Virginia. Campbell's younger sister, Jane, and her husband, Matthew McKeever, operated an important station on the Underground Railroad that aided runaway slaves to escape to the north and even out of the country. Yet Alexander Campbell's own children and their spouses were very pro-secession and pro-slavery, and they were shocked that their own cousin Archibald was against secession. And they accused him of, quote, betraying the Southern cause. Campbell's oldest son, Alexander Campbell Jr., lived on a plantation in Louisiana during the Civil War and served as an officer in the Louisiana State Militia. By the way, Alexander Campbell himself was grieved by the war and the way it divided the churches in what he called the Reformation movement. And at the end of his life, it almost broke him when he saw how the war had divided the churches in the North and the South. David Lipscomb, a man who in many ways was the successor to Campbell, developed distinctly different views about a Christian's relationship to civil government. David Lipscomb was born in 1831, but his family became familiar with the writings of Alexander Campbell in the 1820s. They began reading the Christian Baptist, a periodical he published advocating his views, and they ended up becoming a part of Campbell's Reformation around 1825. Lipscomb's father, Granville Lipscomb, came to see slavery as a great evil and moved from Middle Tennessee to Illinois for the express purpose of freeing the slaves he owned. You were not allowed to free slaves in the South, so he had to move to Illinois in order to do that. But Lipscomb's father would pay a price. He he would pay a price for being faithful to his conscience. While in Illinois, his wife and 3 children died of malaria. And so, overcome by grief, he left Illinois and returned to Middle Tennessee with his 3 remaining children, one of which was his 5-year-old son, David. That son, David Lipscomb, would be deeply affected by the Civil War. It caused him to reevaluate his beliefs concerning the relationship between the Christian and government. Lipscomb shifted from being a strong supporter of American democracy to eventually opposing any kind of involvement of Christians in the government or the military. Lipscomb asserted that governments of men rely primarily on the power of the sword, while the people in the kingdom of God trust in the power of the cross. He therefore embraced a strongly pacifist view and affirmed that any kind of personal involvement in war or the military was fundamentally wrong. Lipscomb came to the conclusion that human governments exist primarily for the benefit of rulers and not for the people. And that assumption would influence his view on Christians and politics. Lipscomb was convinced that for a Christian to enter politics was not only wrong in principle, it was a sin against God. He refused to vote for that reason, and he encouraged other Christians to refrain from voting also. In Lipscomb's mind, those who submitted themselves properly to the government of God had no real connections to human governments at all. Lipscomb's perspective on war and government influenced many in churches of Christ for decades. And so by the early 1900s, Lipscomb's view against government and in favor of pacifism continued to be reflected in several churches of Christ in many parts of the United States. That would start changing during World War I, and a case in point is what happened at a place called Cordell Christian College in western Oklahoma. The faculty and board of Cordell Christian College continued to advocate for the pacifist worldview of David Lipscomb. And as a result, they found themselves in direct conflict with the patriotic fervor that enveloped and surrounded American involvement in World War I. Well, the U.S. government eventually became involved. And in 1917, the Selective Service Board in Cordell accused Cordell Christian College of intentionally subverting the laws of the Selected Service system. The Selected Service Board eventually demanded that the college be reorganized to conform to all military policies and requirements of the government. The board also demanded the immediate resignation of all faculty and administration who held pacifist views. Well, Cordell Christian College had little choice but to close its doors and cease to exist. My grandfather attended a couple of classes at Cordell Christian College. I think it was in 1915 or 1916, but obviously before the college disbanded. Let's move on. Let's go to our own day and time for many of us in Churches of Christ. In the last half of the 20th century, Churches of Christ would become more actively involved in politics than David Lipscomb would probably like. In fact, in 1953, 3 very famous preachers, you may be familiar with these names. In 1953, G.C. Brewer, B.C. Goodpasture, and Baxter Barrett Baxter launched a publication called Voice of Freedom, dedicated to exposing what they called the totalitarian philosophy of both communism and Catholicism. And as a result, in the 1950s and 60s, a very strong philosophy of anti-communism was preached from our pulpits. You probably, some of you probably remember hearing those sermons. I looked on the internet for a copy of that magazine, Voice of Freedom, but couldn't find it. But I've seen it because it was in the foyer of the lobby of the church I grew up in. A lot of our members read it. In 1960, an event occurred which galvanized many members of Churches of Christ to become involved politically. The presidential candidacy of John Kennedy. The opposition of many to Kennedy was not based on his politics, but on his faith. Many feared that Kennedy in his presidency would be influenced and controlled by what they considered to be the autocratic power of the Catholic Church. In my own lifetime, churches and congregations have been actively involved in a lot of political issues. I can remember sermons against liquor by the drink and pari-mutuel betting. And when I was a freshman in college in 1968, I recall hearing a sermon at the Highland Church of Christ condemning America's weakness in foreign affairs. It was about the capture of the U.S. boat, the Pueblo, that some of us remember, and I remember that sermon. That happened to be a weekend that my parents were visiting me at Abilene Christian, and I remember my father's comments when he heard that sermon. He said he agreed with the theme, he agreed with the viewpoint, but he wondered if the pulpit of the church was the proper place to articulate it. Clearly, even in churches of Christ, there has rarely been a time when political issues have been absent from our pulpits. So where are we today in churches of Christ? Which position should we embrace? The overt political participation displayed by Alexander Campbell early in his ministry, or the complete rejection of politics reflected by David Lipscomb? Well, in some circles today, both in and out of the church, there are those who affirm that religion and politics have no legitimate relationship whatsoever. In fact, this is from an editorial a few years ago in the New York Times. We start with the premise shared by every American who believes in the constitutional principles on which our country is founded, that religion has no proper place in American politics. The New York Times and David Lipscomb are in agreement. However, David Lipscomb abhorred the mingling between religion and politics because of the effect it would have on the church. The New York Times, I think, fears the impact it will have on civil government. We've talked about John F. Kennedy. The first Catholic president, John F. Kennedy, went out of his way to assure the public that his religious beliefs would not influence his decisions as president. Many evangelical Protestants expressed the same fears that were felt in churches of Christ, that Kennedy would be dominated by the Catholic Church. And so as a result, Kennedy took great pains to publicly separate his faith from his politics. And at a political event in Houston, Texas, when he was asked how his Catholic faith would influence his governing, he responded with these words: "I do not speak for my church, and my church does not speak for me." There are many who argue that the personal dimension of the religious experience means that it must always be divorced from politics. They assert that faith is primarily a private matter and therefore has no relevance in the arena of public discussion. Several today express that fear, that they fear that the growing political involvement of religious groups threatens political freedom and religious pluralism. And in the minds of some, religious people may not be qualified to deal with secular matters. To them, Christianity is not pertinent to anything but baptisms and weddings and funerals and and personal tragedies. They say that because Christians are otherworldly, that they're not competent to deal with matters of the state. Part of that criticism reflects a complete misunderstanding of what faith is. But another part of it, I guess, is just kind of prejudicial. Because you see, we can make a case that religion does have a proper place in politics. Life under God is not compartmentalized into public and private spheres. For the Christian, Jesus is Lord. He's the Lord of every area of life, including the political. God is the Lord of the ballot box and of the halls of Congress, as well as of private lives and families and churches. Any and every institution that impinges on human life is a concern for God and his people. In John 17, Jesus reminds us that we are not of this world. He reminds us of that, but he also acknowledges that we still live in the world. We're not to separate ourselves from it. And as our life in the world is guided by faith in Jesus, that faith can also guide us to help apply biblical principles, even in the realm of politics. I want to reference a passage we looked at last week, but I want to look at it a little more fully. We're coming to the end of this class, but you remember this one? Let's look at the whole account. This is from Mark, and some people come to Jesus with a question. Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not? Should we pay it or shouldn't we? But Jesus knew their hypocrisy. Why are you trying to trap me, he asked. Bring me a denarius and let me look at it. They brought the coin, and he asked them, whose image is this and whose inscription? Caesar's, they replied. Then Jesus said to them, give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, to God what is God's. Perhaps a superficial reading of this passage could seemingly encourage us to compartmentalize our lives into the secular and the religious. We assume that Jesus is saying that there is the civil realm and there is the religious realm, and that we have responsibilities to each. And that is true. But if that is all we see in this passage, then we will likely keep faith and politics always separate, but we will also ignore the more powerful message that is also contained in these words. Remember what Jesus said. Give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, to God what is God's. What are we called to give back to Caesar? Portion of our finances and taxes to support the government. But what do we give to God? We give God everything we have. Everything we are belongs to him. I want to refer to a verse that David Allen quoted in his sermon about an hour ago when he was talking about human sexuality. It's that verse from 1 Corinthians 6. You are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. The immediate context of that is he's talking about sexual chastity. Your bodies belong to God because he died for you. You belong to him now. And by the way, that is absolutely true. But it's not just our bodies that belong to God and the way we act sexually. Everything about who we are belongs to God. God is the true source of our lives and our redemption. And everything we have and are belongs to him, including our political ideas and opinions. We cannot separate life into this is the religious and this is the civil. For the Christian, every element of life exists under the sovereignty of God and is to be devoted to him. For you see, the church does have a mandate from God to make a difference in and have an impact upon the culture. You remember these verses. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. Christians are a saving and a preserving salt in society. Our purpose is to enrich the culture. We're the salt we bring flavor, we bring enrichment. Yet we must maintain our difference. Christians must maintain their distinctiveness. If they're going to make a difference, we can lose our saltiness. If we become indistinguishable from the world, we become useless. Jesus, I think, through these words, calls us to make a difference in human culture, the culture around us. Christian people, the moral values that we espouse, they're a saving and preserving salt in society. They make a fundamental difference. And sometimes making a difference in our world calls for political participation. It involves things like legislation and regulation and taxation. And I think you can see that in many of our lifetimes in the civil rights movement. But let's also remember, on a deeper level, we make a difference in the world around us because we are salt, because we think and act different from the world. David Lipscomb may have taken an extreme position regarding political involvement, but he does remind us of the fundamental difference reflected in the life of the disciples of Jesus. Those who follow Jesus live according to the power of the cross. The difference they make in the world, we make in the world, is not defined by physical or legal force, but by sacrificial love. Allow me to offer an example by referencing a political issue that I don't think is all that controversial, the legality of prostitution. I think everybody agrees that almost everyone agrees that it's good to keep it illegal. But how do Christians then help produce change in the lives of people who pay or receive money for sex? How do we initiate the process of transformation? We really don't help them change by making sure we always vote to keep prostitution illegal. Now, I know that's probably necessary, but it doesn't really address the problem. We begin the process of change by ceaselessly reminding people of their unsurpassable worth, by serving them, by slowly winning their trust. We initiate transformation when we take up the cross of Jesus and become selflessly involved in the lives of others. For brothers and sisters, the truth of the matter is this: who we are and how we live is more consequential than how we vote. Next week, we're going to address the whole subject of partisanism. And we're just going to talk about how things are today in our churches and in our world of politics. And so please join us next week as we address that whole particular subject. Let's go to the online. Let's get